Thank you, Mina. Thank you, Michael. So it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak today. As Michael said, I'm Director of Research at Alderhay Children's Hospital. By profession, I'm a clinical biochemist, so I've got a great love of biomarkers and diagnostics, and stratified medicine is very close to my heart. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this UKRD Leaders as part of an introduction as to why I think it's an important body which can help you in some of your ambitions in relation to the roadmap that Michael's just described. So I will say something about UKRD, the acronym, tell you something a little bit about our current work and plans to give you a flavour of how I think we can be helpful in this landscape, what might be some specific interactions in relation to stratified medicine and its relationship with the clinical research network objectives, some future context at a broader NIHR scale, and just touch on some practicalities at the end, which we could perhaps pick up on in the sessions this afternoon. So there's a context that perhaps when I think of the term NHS R&D, I don't think of an R&D office. I think of individuals within a complex research landscape who have a leadership role of executing research in the NHS setting. And in the Best Research for Best Health publication in 2006, and its refresh, which is about to be launched soon, there is clearly an omission of any NHS leadership perspective for R&D. And whilst there was a huge expansion in the NHR and the clinical research network, and the volumes increasing in experimental and applied research, NHS R&D was kind of like neglected to some extent, and I think as a consequence has been allowed quite idiosyncratic and variable practice around R&D practicalities and leadership between individual organisations. And there is a sense of a feeling of an abandonment from this broader context. So that was being expressed to senior individuals in NIHR, and I'll talk a little bit about what happened about that. But for example, in 2015, NIHR did recognise this and put in position an NHS engagement lead, William Van Hoff, based in London, who we work with very closely. So in response to this feeling of neglect and abandonment, NIHR and Ashridge decided to bring in NHS R&D Leaders into its leadership programme, supported by the NIHR faculty. And that commenced in 2002 and completed in 2017, so a 5-year programme, and it was participation by application. It was a competitive application. And the application process was that for any organisation, an R&D director and a senior manager needed to attend in partnership. And that was because it was recognised there was a dyad, a dimension, a duality of leadership. Those who have perhaps a more research, clinical focused leadership role, and the managers who have a much more senior operational role, and they complement each other. 5 cohorts were enrolled over that 5-year period, and each participant or dyad stayed on the programme for at least 1 year. So people like myself who came into cohort 1, we stayed with the programme for 5 years. And in all, 100 NHS trusts, so 200 individuals took part in that programme. So it really penetrated quite significantly the NHS R&D leadership body. The tagline for it was about faster, easier clinical research, but actually what it was about, and what became very clear to me and some others very early on, was it was about leadership and about leadership awareness within that sector. So that's just to give you a flavour of the materials that at the time which were promoted to try and get people to engage in the programme, and again a description of quite an intense 5-year programme of activity, forming a community and getting some really important peer support. So from that, myself and Christine McGrath, who's the research director at Southampton, which is a very large teaching hospital, very different to Alderhay. And I guess the beauty of this community and the Ashridge programme was that it really captured the whole representation, the whole gamut of NHS organisations, from huge teaching hospitals to specialist trusts to community trusts, etc. So a lot of effort had been invested, a lot of time and energy into this cohorted programme. So myself and Christine decided that we needed to keep this momentum going. So we decided towards the end of the Ashridge programme to form something we called UKRD Leaders, to take this collegiate approach of R&D leadership forward and form a cogent body which could contribute positively to the NHS R&D landscape. So broadly speaking, at the moment, we're certainly in the stages of early-ish development. So we have a core team. There's 24 of us in the core team, all of whom have taken part in the Ashridge programme, representing different organisations who are bringing the community into its development. We have our dyad, so our partners, either our director or our manager, to double the representation, and now we're in the process of reaching out to the broader network of R&D directors and senior R&D managers to bring that community into the fold. So building on the Ashridge programme, which involved 200 people, we need to capture the imagination of 500 people at least. So we have published a manifesto which has been seen by senior individuals at NIHR. So it's really about some of it about self-formation. How do we form this cogent collegiate body? And some of it is about practice. What are the practices that we will get involved in to add value to the research ecosystem and research landscape? So just to say some of the things that we have been involved in. So the first one, some of you may know, some of you may not, that the Care Quality Commission, so the NHS regulator, will be bringing research into its inspection framework from later this year. So myself representing UKRD has been the NHS R&D individual in that working group. So we are now at the point of having published the domains of inspection for research, the standards, the metrics that we measured. So there's a whole suite of information that's been about to be published which will bring research into the fold. That's been a really big win for UKRD. We've been involved very strongly in new principles for commercial contract recruitment target setting. We've received funding from NIHR to help us establish our own collegiate body. We're preparing for our annual summit meeting at which Chris Whitty and others will be joining us. That's in November. And there are other practical things that we are doing in terms of a presence and establishing the group. Very importantly, we early on, because of interest and direct contact from Louise Wood and Chris Whitty, we have quarterly meetings with Louise and or Chris and other members of the NHR Strategy Board, and we've had 2 of those so far. So that gives us an optic into the NHR strategy, but it also gives Louise and Chris and other senior NHR strategy members an opportunity to have an open discussion with senior NHS R&D leaders. So there are, as I said, it's a complex landscape, and there are other agencies which have a relationship with UKRD. Many of you might be aware of the NHS R&D Forum, which has been established for a number of years, and that's very much a practical, more operational group. It's very well established, but what I think it's failed to do, and it's quite well recognised, it hasn't captured the senior R&D directors into its machinations. So that's where we think we have a competitive advantage. There's also the Association of UK University Hospitals R&D Director Forum, chaired by Professor David Wynick from Bristol, which is a select group and has, by David's direction and chairmanship, a very strong focus on experimental medicine. So it isn't representative of the whole landscape of NHS R&D organisations, and has a very strong focus on early phase experimental medicine. So we believe that the UKRD organisation, I think Louise Wood and Chris Whitty would agree, has a broader constituency which is more relevant to large-scale implementation. So, thinking about UKRD and the Stratified Medicine programme that Michael's talked about, there are many similarities. So, the Deliver schema that Michael just referred to, I guess we could say there are many elements of that within our UKRD platform that are highly relevant. So some of our concepts around leadership are develop a common purpose for NHS R&D leaders, because as I said at the outset, there's been quite a fragmentation across the NHS R&D community that individual practices and strategies and directions of travel have been allowed to meander, and there's been very little collegiate approach. We want to support the development of clinicians to champion and deliver stratified medicine research. So that is, I know, is going on in the CRM, but I think there's parallel things we can do within organisations to complement that. So we could think quite collectively about how we do that across a broad range of NHS organisations. And for research in general, but possibly for stratified medicine in particular, I think we need to start developing within the NHS community an evidence base for leadership and implementation of research delivery. That just doesn't exist. So when I think about what I understand as good disciplines for implementation of research, I've got no idea whether it's just me making up as I go along, because I've got no evidence base to refer to. So bringing senior research leaders together from the NHS R&D platform will allow us to develop an evidence base of what actually is good evidence for research implementation, for example. We need to be very careful and more thoughtful about knowledge transfer. Research directors get together very rarely, and when they do, it's quite a competitive environment. We're defensive, we don't like to give too much away, and we need to really start transferring knowledge for the broader good of the community. And collective leadership across a range of NHS organisations and settings. I mean, the advantage of our UKRD community is that we do have broad representation of different types of NHS organisations. Engagement. I mean, I'm very fortunate I work in a region which has a fantastic relationship between the NHS organisations and the CRN. But I'm aware from my discussions with colleagues nationally that that isn't the case across the country. So UKRD has an opportunity and an important role in smoothing the CRN-NHS interface. I think I'm aware that the screening challenge, so how our organisations through the CRN recognised for the high volume of screening and stratified medicine studies, which doesn't materialise into recruits. And I know that's an ongoing challenge, but perhaps there is an opportunity to put that into the CQC framework so we could recognise the volume of screening as a volumetric in CQC inspection framework. And again, UKRD is very well positioned to have that negotiation discussion with CQC, which might help. Communication, so again, kind of mirroring what some of the things that Michael said. I mean, making research relevant to the NHS and its practitioners. So can we make stratified medicine at the organisational level more relevant to our own practitioners to help build momentum for the delivery of stratified medicine research? Again, I think we can think about mirroring some of the initiatives that are happening in the CRN, again, at an individual organisation level. So not to replicate those sorts of roles, but to give them a different focus, a different optic about internalisation within individual organisations. And then I think we've definitely got a role in prosecuting on a UK-wide basis the principles for national biobanks and universal consent, which again would be great facilitators for improving the landscape for stratified medicine. So as the CRN has had a focus on developing a workforce or elements of its workforce which have a focus on stratified medicine, they operate obviously within NHS organisations in general. So we, again, in NHS organisations, we need to think, well, how can we also do that? You know, for our own the CRN workforce that work in organisations and those who don't. So can we complement and mirror to some extent the initiatives that have been led by the CRN? Where there are curated resources, again, being able to proactively disseminate those. There's quite a bit, I think, to do about, at the macro level, obviously things are happening about the broader understanding and regulations which are relevant to stratified medicine, for example, in genomics research. But I think one of the frustrations is that those regulations can be agreed at a national level, but their interpretation, their implementation at a local level can be quite diverse. And this goes back to this concept of allowing variable practice to happen within NHS organisations. So I think we can do a lot to harmonise the way that nationally agreed regulations are actually implemented at a local level to avoid that disruption and frustration. What about pathology and diagnostic lab requirements? I think again, as an NHS community, R&D leaders can really do something with their own organisations and again ensure that there's cross-fertilisation between labs around the diagnostic requirements to support stratified medicine studies. Studies set up in performance, again an important area which is individual organisations tackle it in different ways. And how can we improve our use of technology within our organisation but learning from other organisations who've done it well. So just finally to touch on some future context. So there are some changes that are happening nationally. So in terms of the refresh of Best Research for Best Health, building on the RAND report, which was commissioned 2 years ago, which is conjecture, but it's certainly driving the thinking at NIHR strategy level. So this concept of taking research into the areas of most unmet health need, where there are health inequalities. And that's very much a mantra from Chris Whitty and Louise Wood. So myself and Christine and Jonathan Sheffield have been asked to attend the November NIHR Strategy Board, representing UKRD and the CRN, to talk about the concept of research following patient need. So that's the title we've been given. So there's a lot of interpretation about what does that mean. Does it mean need at the population level? Does it mean research that need at the individual research participant or individual patient level? It can mean both, of course. So I think Chris and Louise are getting at the population level, moving resources to deliver research in areas where there is strong health inequality or clinical unmet need. But you could also turn it around and say, can we think about personalised research delivery to support stratified medicine, for example? So right study, right patient, right setting type of approach for personalised research delivery, which of course would be quite resource intensive. But in order to mature this thinking, I think we need some co-evolution of both the CRN and NHS organisations to think about how we strike a balance between population-based personal health delivery and individual needs. So some of the thinking that's going on at the moment, and many of you may well have seen this, really at the populational level, is to start to look at disease prevalence and weighted recruitment through CRN support. So this is an example for asthma. So on the right is a weighted map of disease prevalence. This is adult asthma. And on the left is where the recruitment's happening. So you can see there are some huge inequities that where there's a strong disease prevalence, a high disease prevalence, the most of the recruitment isn't happening there. So there's a difficult paradigm here. So the implication is, can we move resources into the areas in dark blue or purple on the right where there's a high prevalence of asthma? And it becomes very granular, so that the CRN for Max team are looking very granularly at disease prevalence across a range of conditions and starting to think, is there a way that resources and skills and expertise can be re-engineered to hit where these areas of high disease prevalence are? Not only within the CRN landscape, but also within other funding bodies, the same issue occurs. So there's a huge amount of funding in London and the southeast, very little funding in the north, which is an example from the Wellcome Trust. So there's all sorts of evidence that the funding for research isn't in the areas where there is greatest unmet health need. And Chris and Louise are thinking about how can we re-engineer what we do, how we fund, etc., to try and redress that balance. So is that going to be positive for stratified medicine, or is it a challenge? Something we can probably talk about this afternoon. So finally, just to think about going back to NHS R&D leaders, what can we do? I think it's a really thing we need to do much more, as I said, about knowledge transfer between NHS R&D influencing leaders. We haven't had much opportunity to do that. The Ashridge programme and the UKRD platform is allowing us to do that more. So that's the benefit research as a whole, and hopefully stratified medicine programmes within that. Even if areas of the country are enriched with research delivery resources, it doesn't mean to say they do it well. So we need to think again about efficiency and effectiveness of the use of resources that are available to deliver research, including stratified medicine research. So in StratMed, where research intensity and research resource utilisation might be quite high, it's even more important to use those resources efficiently and effectively. And again, our UKRD community has got a role to help us to think how to do that, to learn from best practice across organisations. Really important for our R&D leaders to incentivise healthcare professionals within their own organisations to prosecute stratified medicine studies. Again, I think to complement some of the things that Michael said, within our UKRD community, we can start to develop case studies, publications that actually describe how well or not complex studies have been delivered. And that can be generalisable for the NHS R&D landscape to use and learn from, including curated training resources. And I think there's something we can talk about perhaps a bit more today as well, is promoting the use of technology, particularly for diagnostic purposes. So, thank you very much.